The chandeliers above the banquet hall dripped with golden light, their reflections scattered across crystal glasses and polished silver, and yet, beneath that orchestrated grandeur, there lingered a tension sharp enough to slice through silk. Ilara Duskwood sat at the long table, her posture perfect, her expression serene, as though she had been carved from marble and wrapped in midnight velvet. Around her, the city's most influential figures, politicians, financiers, academics, clinked their glasses in shallow toasts, all gathered to celebrate Orion Duskwood's ascent, her only son's graduation from medical school. At the head of the table, Damien Duskwood, her husband of nearly 30 years, leaned forward with a flourish, his voice carrying with the arrogance of a man certain that the room belonged to him. "My friends," he declared, raising his glass, "tonight is not only about my son's achievement, but about new beginnings. As Orion steps into his future, so too do I. Allow me to introduce the woman who will stand by my side in the years to come." Gasps fluttered like startled birds through the hall, and Ilara's gaze, calm as moonlight on water, followed the sweep of Damien's hand as he beckoned forward a younger woman, Mara Vexley, sharp-dressed, ambitious, a creature of polished smiles, who basked in the cruelty of the moment. Whispers rushed along the table's length, some guests averting their eyes, others savoring the spectacle. But Ilara did not flinch. She did not rage. She did not cry. Instead, she placed her glass down with exquisite delicacy, rose with the elegance of a queen untouchable by scandal, and reached into the clutch at her side. When her hand emerged, it carried a black envelope, the kind that whispered of funerals and secrets. With measured steps, she crossed the room, her heels a quiet metronome against the marble floor, and placed the envelope into Damien's palm, as though gifting him the crown he so desperately craved. Their eyes met, his gleaming with triumph, hers unreadable but heavy, like the weight of the ocean pressing down on a drowning man. "For you," she said softly, her voice neither bitter nor broken, but calm, final, terrifying in its restraint. Then, without another glance, she turned and walked out, her figure dissolving into the shadows beyond the gilded doors, leaving behind silence thick enough to choke. In that moment, every guest felt it. The celebration had shifted. The air curdled, and what had been staged as Damien's triumph now felt instead like the first tolling of a bell for his undoing. And yet Damien, intoxicated by his own audacity, clutched the envelope with a smirk, believing still that he had orchestrated the evening, blind to the fact that the trap had already been sprung. The car carried Ilara away from the estate with a silence that seemed alive, the hum of the engine steady as a heartbeat, the driver wisely refraining from words. Beyond the glass, the countryside unrolled in shadows, moonlight painting the world in silver and black, and her reflection floated faintly over the landscape, a ghost watching itself. But it was no ghost that stared back. It was a woman reborn in the fire of humiliation and cooled into steel. Her features, once softened by years of endurance, now bore the clarity of someone who had survived and transmuted suffering into weaponry. The faint creases beside her mouth were not the weary marks of sorrow, but etchings of resilience, lines that spoke of battles endured in silence. She allowed herself one slow breath, releasing years of suppressed words, each exhale a letting go of the woman Damien thought he knew. In her mind, memories unspooled with precision, the empty nights wandering the vast corridors of the Duskwood estate, while Damien entertained his pleasures elsewhere, portraits of ancestors glaring down as if mocking her patience, the endless dinners where she smiled for society, while his absences hung over her like smoke. For decades she had been his shadow, tolerated but never cherished, silent but never blind. She had watched, endured, and in enduring, she had learned. Forgiveness, she had realized long ago, was merely another form of patience, and patience was the whetstone on which she had sharpened her resolve. She thought of Orion, her son, her legacy, her true triumph, raised not in his father's image, but in her own vision, nurtured by her hand, protected by her vigilance. Orion had been her reason to stay, her anchor, the living embodiment of her quiet endurance. Tonight, she had let him glimpse the truth, painful though it might be, so that he could step into his life unshackled by the rod of his father's empire. That was the liberation she had chosen for him, to free him not with words, but with the unveiling of truth. Damien had mistaken her silence for weakness, her loyalty for blindness. He had not understood that silence could be an archive, that loyalty could be strategy, and that every indignity he thought forgotten had been catalogued in her memory, stored until the moment of release. And now that moment had come. Elara leaned back against the leather seat, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed on the darkness rushing past, and in the stillness of that carriage she smiled, a faint, glacial curve of lips that was not joy, not relief, but something far more dangerous. It was the smile of inevitability, of a storm that had already broken, of a reckoning no longer waiting at the horizon, but descending, unstoppable. The black envelope had not been a gesture of despair. It had been a key, turning the lock on a vault Damien had never known existed, a vault she had built in silence over years of betrayal. The war he thought he had begun tonight was already lost, for the battlefield had been chosen long ago, and every move he had made had already been written into his defeat. When Damien finally retreated to his study later that night, the black envelope in hand, his confidence faltered for the first time. He sat alone beneath the weight of ancestral portraits, the fire casting restless shadows across the bookshelves, and with fingers that trembled despite his denial, he drew out the contents. What unfolded was not sentiment, not accusation, but documentation, sheets upon sheets of evidence spilled onto the mahogany desk. Bank statements from offshore accounts he thought untraceable, records of transactions masked by shell companies, hidden debts that threatened to unravel his empire, photographs of hotel rooms with women who had long since been forgotten, each time-stamped, each undeniable. The paper smelled faintly of ink and inevitability, each page a nail in the coffin of his reputation. For years, he had congratulated himself on his cunning, believing himself untouchable, cleverer than auditors, untethered by morality. But here was proof so meticulous, so complete, that even the law would be unable to turn away. His smirk dissolved, his mouth dry, and in the silence of that study, the fire seemed to crackle with laughter not its own. Mara Vexley entered quietly, her expression shifting as she glimpsed the spread before him. Her amusement at Elara's departure drained from her face, replaced by something sharper, fear, then calculation. "What is this?" she whispered, but Damien could not answer, his throat tight as his empire's skeletons rose around him. For the first time, he understood the depth of Elara's silence, the scale of her patience. She had not merely endured, she had documented, constructed, transformed his arrogance into her arsenal. Each sheet was a mirror held up to his corruption, each photograph a reminder that he was never as invisible as he believed. He felt the walls of the estate close in, the stares of dead ancestors accusing, the shadows deepening, and he realized, with chilling clarity, that he was not standing at the pinnacle of triumph, but at the precipice of ruin. Outside, Somewhere in the night, Ilara was not mourning, but waiting, her calm as vast and unstoppable as the tide. Damien clutched the papers, his hands shaking, and understood too late that what he held was not evidence alone. It was verdict. It was sentence. It was the final act of a marriage he had thought ended on his terms. The banquet had not been his coronation, but his unveiling. The night his empire was marked for dismantling. And Ilara, serene, patient, inevitable, was not the abandoned wife he imagined. She was the architect of his ruin, the shadow turned storm, the reckoning that had finally come to claim him. In the end, the ruin of Damien Deskwood was not merely the collapse of one man's empire, but a testament to the truth that betrayal breeds its own executioner. What Damien mistook for weakness had been Ilara's greatest strength. Patience sharpened into precision, silence refined into strategy. In a world that often mistakes loudness for power, it was her restraint, her ability to endure and record, that ensured justice was not only delivered, but inevitable. To the observers who later whispered of the fall of the Duskwoods, the lesson was clear and chilling. Never confuse quiet grace with fragility, and never believe that cruelty, unchecked, will go unremembered. For every shadow cast by arrogance, there exists a light gathering strength in silence, waiting for its moment to burn. And when that light finally reveals itself, it does not simply illuminate, it consumes.